What would you do if you bought an abandoned lighthouse for just $71,000 and discovered a sealed secret room no one had dared to open for nearly a century? Charlotte Evans thought she was buying peace and quiet, but instead, she uncovered a hidden diary, a forgotten family mystery, and a chilling truth buried behind stone walls and government silence. Inside that room, evidence of shipwrecks, coded entries, and a program so secret it never made it to history books. But why were certain ships meant to sink? And what role did her great-grandfather play? Before we start our story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this story reaches. When Charlotte Evans, a 38-year-old archivist from Vermont, stumbled upon a listing for an abandoned lighthouse on a remote stretch of the Oregon coast, she thought it was a joke. The price just $71,000. Crumbling from decades of neglect, the structure stood like a forgotten sentinel on the cliffs, shrouded in sea mist and mystery. But for Charlotte, recently divorced and hungry for a new beginning, it wasn't just a purchase, it was a chance to disappear from the noise and reclaim control of her life. She packed her things, left her old world behind, and drove cross-country to meet her new home, an eerie, weather-beaten lighthouse with shattered windows, rusting railings, and a storm-battered history. The townsfolk warned her, some playfully, others seriously. No one's lasted more than a few weeks there. But Charlotte wasn't easily shaken. On her first night, wrapped in a wool coat and sipping stale coffee, she stood alone at the top balcony, wind howling all around her. She looked out over the endless waves and whispered, "I'm not afraid of ghosts." What she didn't know was this lighthouse didn't need ghosts to haunt her. It had secrets buried deep within its walls. The first few days were filled with the humdrum of restoration. Charlotte worked with gloved hands and a dust mask, sweeping away decades of abandonment. Each creaking floorboard told a story, and every layer of peeling wallpaper hinted at lives long forgotten. She kept a journal not just for repairs, but to document her thoughts, her dreams, her fears. It wasn't just about fixing the lighthouse, it was about rebuilding herself. On the fifth morning, while hauling out old crates from the base-level storage room, she noticed something odd. The northern wall, unlike the others, was colder to the touch. Not just from the coastal chill, but unnaturally cold, like something was trapped behind it. The bricks were slightly off color, almost like they didn't belong. Charlotte knelt beside the wall, her breath visible in the frigid air. She tapped the bricks with a wrench, hollow. She felt her heartbeat thump louder in her ears. With a chisel and hammer, she began carefully picking at the edges of the strange brickwork. What started as curiosity turned into obsession. Behind a loose brick, her fingers brushed against what felt like aged metal. She pulled, expecting a pipe or maybe old wiring, but what she uncovered instead was a narrow lever hidden flush against the wall. She hesitated, then pulled. With a loud click, the entire wall shifted with a low groan. A cloud of stale air burst forth, carrying the scent of mold, rust, and something else, something older. Before her stood a narrow, dust-choked passageway. It was real, a secret room tucked away, invisible to every previous owner, inspector, and historian. She grabbed her flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing thick cobwebs and old wooden beams. Every step deeper echoed like thunder. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper. The narrow corridor led to a low, arched doorway, sealed with iron hinges coated in green corrosion. Her fingers trembled, but she pushed the door open. Inside was a room that looked untouched for nearly a century. The walls were lined with old shelves, most collapsed under their own weight. In the center of the room stood a table, upon which sat a locked wooden chest, a cracked spyglass, and a journal. She moved forward, barely breathing. The journal was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with fraying rope. The cover was worn, the leather etched with initials R. E. Her great-grandfather's name was Richard Ellsworth. She'd heard the name in whispers at family gatherings, always followed by silence and sideways glances. Charlotte sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the remains of a forgotten era. She untied the rope, unwrapped the cloth, and opened the first page. The writing was elegant, deliberate. If you found this, then the time has come. There are truths buried beneath the waves, and not all deserve the light. This lighthouse is not what it seems. We were never just keepers of the flame. Her blood ran cold. Flipping through the pages, she found references to shipwrecks, dozens of them, some of which were never recorded in public logs. There were names of vessels, descriptions of storms that didn't match the historical records, and coded phrases like Operation Gullstone and the Red Signal. The journal was part confession, part warning. But something else caught her eye. Taped to the back of one of the pages was a brittle, yellowed map. Not a nautical one, but a layout of the lighthouse itself, complete with markings for areas that weren't on any blueprint she'd seen. Secret passages, watch points, hidden compartments. Charlotte leaned back, overwhelmed. The lighthouse she had bought, this symbol of peace and retreat, was hiding an entire world beneath its weathered walls, and her family. They had been part of it. Not just caretakers, but operatives of some kind. Protectors. Saboteurs. She didn't know. Not yet. But one thing was clear, this secret room was just the beginning. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Charlotte sat at the small kitchen table with the journal open beside her. The storm outside pounding against the windows like impatient fists. Candlelight flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the cracked plaster walls. The lighthouse groaned under the wind, like it remembered the secrets she had just unearthed. She turned another page. The entries grew more erratic, more urgent. Her great-grandfather's elegant handwriting had devolved into sharp, panicked strokes. Ink blotches stained the paper. Some lines had been crossed out violently. Others were circled again and again. April 16th, 1927. The signal was fired, but the ship didn't alter course. I prayed it would. God forgive us, it crashed. The wreckage washed ashore by morning. No survivors. Among the cargo, weapons, classified, British origin. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She kept reading. We were never meant to know. The beacon program, that's what they called it. The lighthouse was a front, a decoy. We lit the lamp not to guide, but to mislead. Select vessels were diverted. Some rescued. Others sacrificed. She stopped, her hands trembling. The implications were horrifying. Her family hadn't just maintained the lighthouse. They had helped orchestrate shipwrecks. On purpose. She flipped ahead. The entries jumped in time months, even years. It became clear her great-grandfather had started keeping secrets from his handlers. He began recording things he wasn't supposed to, times, coordinates, conversations overheard from radio transmissions. They say some ships carry things too dangerous to reach the mainland, that we're doing the world a favor. But the cost is always the same souls. Charlotte stared at the page. Numb. This was no longer a personal mystery. This was a hidden piece of history, a dark operation, carried out under the guise of a simple coastal lighthouse. The beacon program was never about navigation. It was a covert operation for misdirection, sabotage, and perhaps even silent warfare. Then she reached the most chilling entry of all. October 2nd, 1933. I saw her. She was standing at the top of the stairs, soaked in seawater, her hair tangled in kelp. She didn't speak, just stared. I know that face. I saw it in the report. She was on the Ardent Bell. She wasn't supposed to make it ashore. Charlotte slammed the journal shut. Goosebumps prickled across her skin. She hadn't read that name anywhere else. No shipwreck called the Ardent Bell had ever been recorded publicly, or at least, not that she could find. She raced to her laptop and typed it in. Nothing. No records, no news articles, no survivor logs. Erased. Covered up. Was the woman her great-grandfather saw real a ghost? Hallucination. Or worse, was she alive when the wreck happened? Suddenly, a loud creak echoed from upstairs. Charlotte jumped, knocking the candle over. Wax spilled across the table. She grabbed her flashlight and rushed to the staircase. The upper floor had always felt strange colder. Somehow. The previous owners had sealed most of it off due to safety concerns. But now she had to know. The hallway stretched out like a spine, the walls warped from salt and time. At the far end was a door that never opened, rusted shut. She pressed against it. Nothing. But then she remembered the map in the journal. She sprinted back down, unfolded the fragile page, and found the marking N3. North, 3rd floor, hidden hinge. She returned. Felt along the edge of the hallway wall, pressing, tapping, until she heard a soft click. A thin panel popped open. Behind it a ladder, descending into darkness. She hesitated, then climbed down. The air was thick, stale, and humid. Her flashlight revealed a subterranean chamber carved into the cliff. It was dry, but barely. The room was empty except for a metal cabinet bolted into the stone wall. Inside a stack of documents, most water-damaged, some still legible, stamped with bold red letters confidential, U.S. Naval Authority. And there it was again, Ardent Bell, Incident Report. Charlotte skimmed through it. Her heart sank. Civilian vessel redirected off course under Beacon 3 protocol. Misread signal confirmed. Cargo not recovered. One unaccounted female. Presumed drowned. Vessel officially listed as lost at sea. They knew. They had let her drown. Or so they thought. Charlotte stepped back, her hand against her mouth. The woman her great-grandfather saw. She wasn't a ghost. She was a survivor. A witness. And somewhere along the line, someone made sure her story was never told. The room suddenly felt suffocating. This wasn't just family history. This was a cover-up. And she had just become the first person in nearly a century to know the full truth. Charlotte didn't sleep that night. She sat curled in the old reading chair beside the lighthouse's main lantern, the pages of the journal trembling in her lap, her body wrapped in a blanket that offered no comfort. The rhythmic crash of waves below, once soothing, now sounded like accusations hurled from the ocean itself. Everything had changed. Her entire understanding of her family's past had collapsed. Growing up, she'd been told tales of brave lighthouse keepers who lit the way during storms, guardians of the sea who protected ships from harm. But the truth was darker. Her great-grandfather wasn't a savior. He was a participant in a covert system that decided who lived and who died at sea. And now she was living in the very building where those choices were made. The wind howled louder, almost as if the lighthouse itself was mourning. Charlotte stood and gazed out the window. From this height, she could see the faint outlines of jagged rocks far below rocks that had torn hulls apart. She tried to imagine the Ardent Bell, sailing unknowingly toward disaster, misled by a light that should have saved them. What kind of man could allow that to happen? What kind of legacy had she inherited? The next morning, she walked into town, a place she had visited only a few times since arriving. It was a sleepy little coastal village, quaint, with fishing boats bobbing in the harbor and coffee shops that served the same 5 locals every morning. But now, it felt sinister. Who here had known? Who had benefited? Who had stayed silent? At the local archive center, she found nothing. No mention of the Ardent Bell, no wreck reports, no casualties, just a quiet gap in history. But on her way out, she spotted something. An old bulletin board faded, ignored, a newspaper clipping yellowed by time, nearly hidden beneath layers of community flyers. The headline read, "Local Woman Lost at Sea. Family Demands Answers." The photo beneath it was blurry, but Charlotte recognized the face instantly. The woman from the journal, the one her great-grandfather claimed to have seen, the survivor. Her name was Margaret Cole. Charlotte's fingers traced the photo. The article mentioned the incident but lacked details. Mechanical failure. It said, "Heavy storm," but the final line chilled her. Her body was never found. Back at the lighthouse, Charlotte opened the journal again. She began rereading the later entries this time, not with horror, but with intent. What if her great-grandfather wasn't just a participant? What if he had turned against the very operation he once served? There were signs, mentions of regret, of protecting the girl, of hiding certain logs and maps. Was it possible? He tried to save Margaret. Charlotte flipped to the final page. There, written hastily and faded nearly beyond recognition, was one last message. "I buried what I could. They'll come looking. But if she's alive, she must tell the truth. This place was never meant to stay silent." Charlotte's hands shook. He knew. He wanted the secret to be revealed, but never had the chance. Now, nearly a century later, she was the one holding the pieces, and she couldn't ignore them. For the first time since arriving, she saw the lighthouse not as a haunted place, but as a monument of guilt, a relic of power used in the wrong hands. It wasn't just about her family, it was about justice delayed, buried, denied. She made a decision. Charlotte descended into the secret room once more and photographed everything: the journal, the map, the government documents. She uploaded them to a private cloud, printed copies, and placed them in a fireproof box. But more than that, she wrote a letter, addressed to Margaret Cole if she was still alive, or to her family, or to anyone who had wondered, for decades, what truly happened to that lost ship. She mailed it to the only address she could find. Then she waited. A week passed. The fog that usually clung to the coastline seemed heavier than ever, as if the ocean itself was holding its breath. Charlotte had returned to her routines, sweeping floors, cataloging artifacts, repairing broken windows, but her mind was always elsewhere. She kept checking the mailbox. Nothing, until one gray morning, as she poured herself a mug of bitter instant coffee, she heard a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate taps. She froze. No one ever came out this far. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and even the delivery trucks refused to climb the crumbling road past the rocky bluff. She set her cup down, walked cautiously to the door, and opened it. A man in his 60s stood there, rain dripping from his trench coat, his expression unreadable. He held a small leather satchel and a folded envelope in one hand. "Charlotte Evans?" he asked. She nodded. "My name is Adrian Cole. I believe you sent a letter about my grandmother." The world tilted. Margaret Cole hadn't disappeared without a trace. She had survived. She'd lived a full life. And now, her grandson was standing at the doorstep of the very place where it all began. Charlotte invited him in, her hands trembling slightly. She offered him tea, which he declined. He sat at the kitchen table, the journal lying between them like a loaded weapon. "I didn't know what to expect when I read your letter," Adrian began. "My grandmother never spoke much about her past, but when I showed her the copy of that journal page, the name of her ship, the handwriting, she cried. It was the first time I'd ever seen her weep." Charlotte's throat tightened. "She's alive," she whispered. He nodded. 89 years old, living in a care home near Portland. Her mind comes and goes, but that letter you woke something up. Charlotte couldn't believe it. The girl from the wreck, the woman who had been erased from history, still breathing. "I want you to meet her," Adrian said. Charlotte blinked. "You think she'd want to see this place again?" He smiled faintly. "She insists on it." 3 days later, Margaret Cole returned to the lighthouse. She was frail, her eyes clouded with time. But when she stepped out of the car and looked up at the towering structure, a strange strength radiated from her. Charlotte stood beside her, unsure of what to say. But Margaret spoke first. "It still smells like salt and secrets," she murmured. "Inside." Charlotte led her slowly up the winding stairs, through the narrow corridors, and finally into the hidden room. Margaret's eyes scanned every detail, her hand brushing the stone walls like she was greeting an old enemy. "I remember the crash," she said quietly. "The light came from the wrong side. We followed it straight into the rocks. I swam. I don't even remember how long. I thought I was dead." Charlotte sat silently, letting her speak. "A man found me. He didn't wear a uniform. Said his name was Richard. He hid me here, in this very room. Said it wasn't safe. That others would come looking. And then, he disappeared." Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. "He was my great-grandfather." Margaret looked at her. Something soft and sad behind her expression. "He saved me, but he couldn't save the others. I spent my life wondering if I imagined him, if anyone would believe me." "You were right," Charlotte said. "You weren't supposed to survive. But now, people will know." Over the next several weeks, Charlotte and Adrian worked together to digitize every document, every journal page, every piece of evidence they could find. Margaret recorded a video statement, her voice shaky but clear as she recounted her story. Charlotte uploaded it all to a public archive, submitting copies to journalists, historians, and maritime investigators. And the world listened. The story of the Ardent Belle made national news. The Lighthouse That Lied. One headline read, "Secrets in the Fog." Read another. And with each article, Charlotte felt the weight slowly lift from her shoulders. But with recognition came resistance. Former government agencies denied involvement. Anonymous emails warned her to let the dead rest. Some locals grew cold, blaming her for tarnishing the town's legacy. One even left a note on her door. "You should have let it rot." Charlotte didn't care. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just uncovering the past, she was giving it a voice. And more importantly, she was giving it justice. Winter came early that year. The wind off the Pacific bit through coats like knives, and the skies above the lighthouse stayed a constant hue of gray. But inside the weathered old tower, a quiet transformation was underway. Charlotte had become something else, not just a homeowner or even a historical researcher. She had become the lighthouse's new keeper, only this time she was guarding the truth. Since the story broke, she'd received hundreds of emails, some from descendants of lost sailors, others from historians hungry for lost records. Journalists called daily. Even universities wanted access to the materials. But Charlotte had stopped replying, because the attention wasn't what mattered. Margaret's story, her survival, her silence, her bravery that was the heart of it all. The lighthouse had tried to bury her. Charlotte had made sure it would never do that again. Each day now began the same. She would climb the spiral staircase to the lantern room, light a single candle, not because it helped, but because it felt symbolic. Then sit and read from the journal again. Not because she needed to, but because she felt like someone was listening. Her great-grandfather had started something, then died with guilt. She was determined to finish it with truth. But even as she grew stronger, the weight of it all still lingered. At night, Charlotte would lie awake listening to the waves and wonder, what else have we buried beneath history? How many truths have been smoothed over like stones on the shore? One day, while organizing a shelf of documents she hadn't touched since the initial discovery, she found something she had missed. A letter, sealed, never opened. The paper had yellowed, the wax cracked with age, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Richard Ellsworth. It was addressed simply to the one who finds the light. Charlotte sat down slowly and opened it. If you are reading this, then the lies are no longer safe. I was wrong to follow orders. I thought we were protecting people. But in the end, we were protecting power. You deserve to know everything. Burn the rest, if you must, but don't let them write the history again. Let them read it. Her heart broke. In that moment, she no longer saw her great-grandfather as a villain. He had made terrible choices. Yes, but he had also fought, in his own quiet way, to undo them. And now, she was the echo of that resistance. The following week, Charlotte stood in front of a crowd for the first time. The local town had invited her to speak at the Historical Society, some out of curiosity, others out of quiet resentment. They still whispered behind her back, still called her the one who stirred up ghosts. She didn't care. She told the full story. About Margaret Cole, about the decoy light, about the beacon program. She even read from Richard's final letter, her voice steady, her hands no longer trembling. When she finished, the room was silent. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. By the end, people were on their feet, not because they approved of the past, but because someone had finally had the courage to tell it. That night, Charlotte returned to the lighthouse and looked out at the sea. For the first time, she felt peace. Not because everything was fixed, far from it, but because the silence had finally been broken. She no longer felt haunted. She felt anchored. Weeks turned into months. Charlotte turned the lighthouse's lower floor into a museum, small but powerful. One room displayed artifacts from the hidden chamber. Another held Margaret's recorded testimony. A third honored the names of those lost ships engraved in brass, polished every week. Children came to learn. Survivors' families came to grieve. And Charlotte, once a woman running from her past, now stood firmly in the center of history, shoulders square, voice steady, heart changed. The waves had always spoken, sometimes in roars, sometimes in whispers. But now, for the first time, Charlotte felt like she could understand them not as noise, not as a warning, but as memory. It had been 6 months since the story of the lighthouse went public. 6 months since Margaret Cole stood inside its walls for the first time in almost a century. 6 months since Charlotte became something she never imagined, a symbol of truth. And now, on the day of the dedication ceremony, she stood alone again on the balcony of the lighthouse, just as she had that first night, when the place still held secrets, and she still thought ghosts were the scariest thing it could offer. Now she knew better. The real ghosts were the truths we bury, and worse, the ones we ignore. The wind tugged at her coat as she looked down at the crowd gathering below. Dozens of people stood on the cliffside, bundled against the cold. Some were reporters, some were tourists, but most were descendants of sailors, of lighthouse keepers, of those whose stories had never been told. Margaret couldn't attend. Her health had declined sharply in recent weeks, But Adrian was there, standing quietly near the edge, holding a photograph of his grandmother as a young woman, the same face Charlotte had seen in that newspaper clipping so long ago. Charlotte stepped to the microphone, clearing her throat as the crowd fell silent. "I didn't come here looking for history," she began. "I came here running from mine." Soft chuckles rippled through the audience. "I bought this lighthouse because it was quiet, because it was far away, because it was cheap." She smiled slightly. "But what I found was something I never expected. I found lives buried in these walls. I found silence that had lasted too long." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I found a woman who had survived something no one should have. And I found a man, my great-grandfather, who helped her, then died carrying the guilt of the things he couldn't change." Charlotte's eyes drifted toward the lighthouse behind her. This place once sent out the wrong signals. It misled. It deceived. It brought people to ruin. But today, we light it for a new reason, not to erase what happened, but to remember it. She reached for a small switch beside the podium, and to remind the world that even places built on lies can be reclaimed by truth. With a soft click, the lantern room above them lit up, not with the blinding white of old, but with a warm, golden glow. It bathed the cliffside in light, casting long shadows over the waves. The crowd applauded. Some wiped tears. Others stood in reverent silence. Adrian stepped forward, handed her a small plaque. Charlotte took it, reading the inscription. "The lighthouse that told the truth, dedicated to those lost, those who survived, and those who dared to remember." She held it tightly. Later that night, after the crowd had dispersed and the sun had dipped below the horizon, Charlotte stood alone in the lantern room. The light still glowed, soft and steady. She ran her hand along the railing, the cold metal grounding her. Everything had changed within her and around her. No longer a runaway, no longer just a historian, no longer just a name on a deed. She was a storyteller, a truth keeper, a voice for the silent. The past didn't scare her anymore. Because she had seen what truth could do. It couldn't undo pain. It couldn't bring back the dead, but it could set something right. It could let people heal. And healing was enough. As the moon rose over the Pacific, Charlotte whispered to the waves, "You can rest now." The lighthouse didn't groan like it used to. It stood quiet, still weathered, still scarred, but no longer haunted. It had finally told its story, and so had she. Not everyone buys a lighthouse to find peace, but sometimes peace finds you only after the truth has been spoken aloud. As the sun slipped behind the waves off the Oregon coast, Charlotte Evans stood once more beneath the warm, golden glow of the lantern she had reignited, not to guide ships, but to shine a light on the stories that had been buried too long. She wasn't just the woman who uncovered a hidden room. She had opened a chapter in history no one else dared to read. And now, that truth didn't belong only to her. It belonged to every family who never got closure, every survivor who was told to stay quiet, and every soul who once believed secrets were stronger than justice. The great-granddaughter of a man who kept the light burning had become the woman who finally made it shine for the right reasons. Because for Charlotte, and for those who carry stories untold, the past is no longer a weight. It's a torch. And some torches are meant to be passed on. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep uncovering the truth and hit subscribe if you believe silence was never the end of the story.